Okay. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Maybe we can start now. Sorry for the slight delay. We were just trying to ensure that the deputants had virtual access. But the presentation is first, so we will commence the meeting, and we've got folks making sure that the deputants can speak after the presentation. So I'd like to call the meeting to order. Yeah, I know how to do it.
I'm sorry.
Ann Morgan. This is the chair. I'm the chair of the Toronto Police Service Board, and I'd like to welcome you all to this hybrid meeting of the board's budget subcommittee. We acknowledge that the land we are on as we hold this meeting is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse Métis nations, Inuit, and First Nations people. The board also acknowledges Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 signed by the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaty signed with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. At this point, are there any declarations of interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act or the Code of Conduct for the Police Service Board members? Seeing none, thank you. I will now turn it over to the board's acting executive director, Danielle Dowdy, who will go over the meeting's logistics.
Sorry, doing too many things at once. Thank you to everyone who's joined us in person as well as who's online. Please note that this meeting is also being live. What's on? I'm too soft-spoken?
Is it loud enough?
Can't hear me? Okay.
Just a touch. Here you go.
Thank you. Please note that this meeting is also being live streamed on the Toronto Police YouTube account and will be available at the conclusion of this meeting. Joining us in person, we have members of the board's budget subcommittee, Chair Ann Morgan, Councillor Shelley Carroll, Board Member Nick Migliori, Vice Chair Lisa Kostakis. We also have members of our board staff, CAO Savina Dhaliwal, Deputy Chief Lauren Pogue, Director Ian Williams, members of the service, and of course, members of the public. We have individuals who registered to make deputations both in person as well as virtually on our agenda items. As per our regular meeting process, deputations will be heard prior to the item being discussed and voted on by members. When it comes time to do a deputation, those who have registered will be called upon and or brought into the meeting by my colleague, Caitlin Chapman. As always, deputants will speak, followed by an opportunity for board members to ask them questions. Thank you. Over to you, Chair.
Thank you. At this part, we have a presentation. I'll turn it over to CAO Dhaliwal and her team, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, kind of early evening, everyone. As was already mentioned, I have Director Ian Williams and Deputy Pogue with me. I believe I saw Deputy Johnson joining virtually, and behind me is really the dream team that does all this work. And so we'll dive right into the presentation. This is our second budget subcommittee. It follows the first one that was board-led, but it also follows the full board meeting. So at the last one, we presented the multi-year hiring plan. So our plan is to continue the conversation between the subcommittees and the full board meetings between now and the end of the year. So similar to last month, each presentation is supposed to sort of build from one month to the other. So you will see slides and repetition from previous presentations. And the purpose really today is to give an update on the development process of the budget, Director Williams will also spend some time on some of our operational metrics that influence our work and our resource requirements. And we'll also spend a bit of time just recapping the budget history that, and providing some insights on the many decisions along the way that we are looking at and discussing between now and the end of the year. So just in terms of timing, what you'll see on the chart is we are in the thick of the process, but early still in the process. This chart represents both the board's timeline, the Toronto Police Service Board's timeline, because this presentation will first obviously be presented from the subcommittee to the board, and then from there to the city's process. And so one thing just to note in the timing is that our current plan is for the budget to go to the November 27th budget subcommittee with a view that this subcommittee would deliberate and make the recommendations and then move it to the December 12th full board meeting. In order to meet that date, however, it does necessitate that we have concluded all of the staff-to-staff discussions between, the service finance staff, between city staff, and similar to last year, we endeavored a similar process, but last year we had not actually concluded on a lot of the open items. You will recall last year the new Ontario deal was also in active discussion around the same time, and so that delayed the overall presentation and ability to request, sort of make our budget request until December. So should something similar happen, then what the next meeting will be is just another update for information purposes like today. But if we can conclude all our discussions, then the goal would be that on November 27th, that next budget subcommittee, we would come forward with our full ask. Okay. And so certainly the timing between now and the end of the year is just something as you think about the city's consultation process, our board's consultation process, just something that, we're certainly open in terms of guidance and next steps on what those next few meetings look like. So very quickly to recap what we presented at the last full board meeting in terms of our multi-year hiring plan. We presented we costed effectively three main scenarios that varied from replacement hires only to growing with the city vis-a-vis like maintaining our cop to pop. And we talked about our preferred option of 4 classes of 90, which is the current provincial training allocation. For scenario purposes only, we estimated, a 1 to 3 civilian to sworn ratio with an understanding that on the civilian side, the positions would be detailed out as part of an annual budget request. The 3 scenarios ranged from staying at the current established number of officers, 5433, or depending on the scenario, increasing anywhere from 400 to 800 over a 5-year period of frontline officers. Not including the civilians, what that had translated to was anywhere from 20 to 35 million a year, depending on the scenario and depending on the year. What we had also presented and we sort of talked about were the 2010 service levels, where the priority 1 response time was 12 minutes, recognizing that 2010-2011 would be considered the peak in terms of funding levels and officer levels in the last 25 years. Currently, we are working on this type of modeling through a third party. We're working actively with Environics. I did briefly today see how the modeling is coming along. Kind of an overall, one of the models is almost there. The team is just reviewing some of the formulas and the assumptions, just doing some due diligence work. But I do expect that at the November 27th meeting, we will present the Environics work in some form at the subcommittee. But really the reality is all these scenarios and models, they simply serve as a guide. They are a guide to give us a sense of the gap. It gives us a sense of what the sandbox and the parameters are based on, but ultimately it comes down to service levels and response times and needing to balance all of that with an ability to hire, train, and obviously fund to different service levels. And so what concluded, this topic effectively concluded last month with a board motion through our board, and what the thing to know is that the conversations with the city are still ongoing. We have talked about various hybrid options. We have looked at what if civilians are completely a separate decision point? What do we do with laterals? How do you smooth out the financial impacts? And so those discussions are very much still ongoing. So we will not be presenting sort of what that hybrid option will look like yet, but we do expect for November 27th to present something back. So that starts to now take us into, you know, the meat of the current kind of the go forward. And we're going to start with some of the strategic and operational context that will inform our budget. So this slide always guides us: adequate and effective service delivery. It is a legal requirement. It is found in provincial legislation. Similar to last year, our board report and our final budget request, it will talk about and be structured around the generally accepted standards, which are listed on the right in terms of what does adequate and effective really mean. And so you will expect, we will elaborate more on this in the November 27th meeting, as well as in the board report that we will put forward in December. Recognizing that the board is also in the middle of developing an overall strategic plan. You know, the command team, when it fully came together last year, we worked hard on developing a vision and a direction of where, you know, we're looking to take the service. This budget does include the strategic efforts we're looking to make that recognize that the service, the Toronto Police Service, are the public safety experts of the city, with a mandate that does include stopping crime and disorder while also acting with compassion. We have a role to play when it comes to breaking cycles of harm, designing safety into the city, and our work can only happen through trusted partnerships and co-designing, co-developing, and co-delivering with community and key stakeholders. And in order to achieve the vision and the direction, we have oriented our objectives and actions around process reform, enabling change in the broader ecosystem, not just through our own service procedures, looking and refining our service design and our overall delivery model, and building partnerships. The other lens that we look at our multi-year budgeting and overall plans through is really a risk management lens. We, in fact, welcome a multi-year planning because it does allow us to better plan for and manage the very real risks that our members and the service overall face every day. It's in our effort and in our attempt of being able to deliver adequate and effective service delivery. So adequate resourcing for us is key in the face of increasing workload, highly manual processes that necessitate technology and modernization, and a workforce that is younger and younger in a highly competitive labor environment. Our members have thousands of engagements daily with the public and are consistently assessing risk, minimizing service delivery failures in a very public, highly scrutinized environment. And so if we think about some of the workload drivers that we will talk about and that influence our resource requirements and our overall resource allocation, population growth is certainly a key part of that. We live in a vibrant, dense, and a very fast-growing city. And as we spoke about last month, you know, COP to POP, it's certainly only one proxy of measure for workload. It's not the definitive and only answer, but it certainly does help us explain and demonstrate how officer presence and service levels and funding levels correlate. And so what this slide shows us is that the city has grown by 20% in the last 14 years. And even after 2 years of hiring, which we are very grateful to have the support to have done, we have effectively remained flat. It shows a negative 2% decrease in the number of officers deployed. We know that we're comparing ourselves to the peak to where we're at now. What I would say is even when you go back to 2001, what you will see is that there is a 17% decrease in our COP to POP. So while overall staffing levels are comparable to where we would have been in the early 2000s, the city itself has grown considerably even when you go back to 2001, that overall COP to POP, even when you go back, you will still see that it's 17% less than compared to early 2000s. It's also important to know, and I think I try to say this as often as I can, our goal is not just to linearly grow with the population. There have been and will continue to be efforts to modernize, to create and absorb growth, create capacity, and continue to increase our focus on core service delivery. And so this slide and the next slide talk about that history of modernization. So things like disbanding units and reallocating. So we disband units in order to reallocate to more pressing priorities. Optimizing officer availability by updating shift schedules. Centralizing work in particular cases for more efficient investigations. Diverting calls through two other paths, whether that's 211, TCCS, or even just diverting online. And civilianizing in order to match the right skills for the right work. And so these are all very real and tangible efforts that have helped create capacity, but also have resulted in cost avoidance through asks that simply are not made because we are absorbing them. The reality, though, is that any of the capacity that gets created, it is still less than the amount of demand that is grown for the service. So that is our challenge. We're making slivers of improvements in many, many, many areas to curb demand, but there still is a natural growth in demand that happens that overtakes many of those improvement efforts. And certainly while all of these capacity creating efforts are being undertaken, we are also modernizing to move towards community safety and well-being as an overall mindset. So that implies the active participation with SafeTO, leading our focus tables, supporting the city's traffic warden program, things like that maybe aren't creating direct capacity, but are certainly part of our overall strategic vision and direction. Internally, I think it's also important to highlight internal reform is also occurring at the same time, and the budget request we're hoping will include continued commitment to whether it's overhauling our people processes, continuing to develop our leaders, modernize our systems and IT infrastructure in order to create more capacity through technology, and continuing to work as an organization transparently, fairly, and in a fiscally prudent way. So the last two slides summarize a number of our efforts, and when we talk about, how much does this all save, we've talked about since 2015, we believe there's at least $400 million in cumulative cost avoidance. So that's in the last 8 to 10 years. And we have costed some of them out just to give you a sense of how we calculate that. Certainly the hiring freeze, the moratorium that happened over an 18-month period, that is tangible savings that happened over a period of time. There's some sustainability initiatives, there's civilianization, there's even just slowing down civilian hiring and increasing our planned vacancy rate. And so over time, and even just reallocation of internal resources, by disbanding units. So we do have, we've listed a subset of what makes up that 400 million, just to give a sense of how that's calculated over time. And so it's important to always recognize that there really is no city like Toronto in North America. And we do, certainly in this presentation and in others, we do high-level comparisons with other large cities, but there are characteristics about this city that certainly create unique demands for service, and this does tie to the services we deliver and where we reallocate them. We are the fastest growing city in North America. We have grown almost 500,000 residents since 2010, and even if you go back to 2001, we've grown to close to 600 since then. So just to put that into perspective, that's the equivalent of the size of London. And if we look at London and how many officers they have, it's approximately 600 officers. That exponential growth, that will continue. We're expecting it to continue in the next 2 years. We all know we have one of the highest amount of cranes in the sky, and density is certainly one of the main objectives. With that does come increased workload demands. We estimate for every 100,000 that the city grows, there's about 65,000 calls for service that come in to 911. Not all of them are necessarily emergency calls, but it certainly gives a pulse on how the workload does increase, obviously with greater population. And when we talk about COP to POP and similarities with other cities, we have 27.5 million visitors that we do not factor in to any of the kind of population type analysis. With major baseball and basketball teams and FIFA coming up and Taylor Swift coming in the next month. I mean, we are not only an economic hub and a tourist hub, but as we have seen with also more than 2,000 events and protests, we are a geopolitical hub for events and demonstrations, unlike anything that exists anywhere else in North America. And now I'm going to turn it over to Director Ian Williams just to talk about some of our operational metrics that inform our resource levels and some of the gains we certainly have made over the last couple years with the much appreciated investment in the last 2 years.
Good afternoon. I'm going to highlight a few of the key metrics that support the operational context. You'll see many metrics on the following slides. I'll highlight, as I mentioned, just a few of those. Speaking to our 911 response and patrol, some of the key metrics associated with this are our calls for service. The volume of calls which we receive each year has been increasing year over year for quite a number of years. Last year, we had over 2 million calls come into our call center, and related to that, we dispatched officers to an increasing number of top priority calls, those ones that we would refer to as a priority 1 or priority 2 call, where there's a danger to an individual's life. And so we are seeing that volume increase on a year-over-year basis, and what that's doing from a demand and resource side is we are allocating more and more officers to those highest priority calls. And of course, we would expect, in relation to that, high levels of complexity. These are violent events, they're impacting community safety, and I'll get into more detail on that in relation to some of the investigations and victim support. Despite that increasing number of calls, we have seen in the past year, so 2024 year to date compared with last year, an improvement in our P1 response times. So that moved from what we were seeing late last year, approximately 23 minutes on average, down to now about 17.4 minutes. So a notable improvement, although again, with the demand for those calls increasing, that pressure continues, and we expect that it will continue as we look forward as well. A few of the key indicators around investigations and victim support, we have seen year-over-year increases in shootings. So this year particularly, we've seen nearly 50% increase in those gun violence related occurrences. Hate crimes, as we've talked about a lot over the past year, have increased 41%. so far this year, and that's compared to last year where we also saw notable increases as well. Our homicides so far this year are up approximately 20%, and firearm arrests have increased as well. So a lot of that effort moving towards investigations and dealing with some of those highest violent related activities is increasing. As we have mentioned a lot over the past approximately 2 years now, we put a lot of effort into auto thefts, carjackings, those home invasions associated with stealing cars, and auto theft more generally, and some improvements in the auto theft numbers so far this year compared with last year is about a 20% improvement, and we are hoping that that can continue, although as you would expect, it takes high degrees of resource allocation, high coordination with other jurisdictions in order to address these types of offenses as well. From a crime prevention perspective, we are increasing our work across various partners who are delivering community supports in the city. And so our referrals to other agencies is increasing as well. In terms of focus, a key program, of course, in the city, the service makes approximately 70% of the cases from our referrals that go across that focus table. And last year, that was nearly 800 referrals. In addition to that, as you know, we do a lot of gang exit referrals. So some of our highest risk community members in the city, we offer referral opportunities for them to find alternatives to some of that high violence gang activity that we see in many of our communities in the city. In addition to that, our neighborhood community officers also conduct referrals consistently throughout their days. So just as a part of a normal course in the day-to-day activity of a neighborhood officer, referrals are made consistently throughout their activities as well. And so a lot of that work continues across a number of key areas from a crime prevention perspective. We've talked a lot about, over the past year particularly, but we've seen year-over-year increases as well in the number of events and protests that we're providing really critical security and event and protest management services at. And from a public safety perspective, increasingly these are very complex events. We bring a lot of diverse perspectives from different communities, and they're often increasingly reflecting geopolitical events here in our city. So they come with a lot of tension often, and so far this year, we're trending towards the number where we were last year. I don't want to predict whether we'll exceed last year's 2,000 plus events or not, but we are very quickly moving towards that number. And this is likely the level that we can expect as we move forward, a very high degree of fast-moving, unplanned, complex events that are taking place all across the city. And the resource allocation towards these events, of course, it diverts attention from other service delivery areas, which is challenging, of course, in a number of different ways. From a traffic and parking enforcement lens, we are increasing our traffic enforcement, so shifting from approximately 700 tickets issued each day last year to over 800, moving towards 900 per day so far this year. And this has obviously a number of key aspects to trying to improve traffic flow, improve traffic safety. A lot of that is focused, of course, around Vision Zero. And when we're seeing approximately 67,000 collisions in the city each year, almost 40,000 calls for service to attend traffic-related events, that level of enforcement is, I think, notable in the areas where we're providing it. I think I'll pause there and shift to some of our really key call for service indicators. Again, these are the ones that we use the most in the service. We've talked about these, of course, at board meetings pretty regularly. These are ones that the chief in command and our operational colleagues across the service reference when we think about somebody calling 911 and the time that it takes for an officer to attend that call and address it. These priority 1, priority 2 events, of course, are the ones where they are the most concerning from a danger to life perspective. And priority 1 events particularly have dispatch areas from anybody across the city to attend those in as timely a fashion as possible. Priority 2 events are comparable to this. Again, thinking about those, we're dealing with robberies, we're dealing with missing people who are vulnerable, very high degree of priority for those. And these have comparable dispatch, but closer in proximity. The combination of those two would represent the most notable calls that we receive, and both of these areas are increasing in volume each year. So for quite a number of years now, the number of calls that we receive and calls that we attend as an organization delivering this top priority service delivery for the city, these are increasing, and I think it's really worth noting that. In terms of other priorities, of course, as we move into each of the other categories, they are lower priorities, so shifting away from a danger to life, more into property crimes or some of those events where it's not needing that instantaneous or urgent response, and we capture those, of course, as well. What I'll focus on here, again, key metric that we use across the service on a continuous basis. All levels of the organization focus on this particular metric and understanding how it's impacting our community members. Priority 1 calls attended. So you can see where we are this year so far, approximately 17.5 minutes on average to attend these calls. And that's despite an increase in the volume of those calls. So it's up about 3.7% so far this year. As I mentioned, this is continuing year over year. So every year we are seeing more of these calls coming in. Our officers are attending more of those as well. And so far this year, we've been able to improve the response time through very concerted and deliberate resource deployment, a lot of management activities to support this, and deployment of new recruits as well in a very strategic manner. And we'll highlight just momentarily some of the ways in which that's occurred. You can see from this chart, again, you'll see the end of last year, a peak, and certainly what we would hope would be a peak in our response times for P1 calls, where we hit almost 27 minutes in terms of how long it was taking to attend a P1 event. And since that point, through some strategic resource deployments of recruit classes, we've seen up until this point, and looking forward, again, I'm not going to predict, but we've had approximately 17.5 minutes so far this year. You'll see that it's flattened a little bit, really since the beginning of summer, and as we look forward, we hope to at least maintain that. Again, resource deployment being critical in terms of continuing a downward trajectory there. These are our community safety indicators. Again, a number of really key items which we use operationally all throughout the organization, from the command tables to CPLCs at divisions to some of our crime, traffic, and order management activities that occur at every community level across the organization. These are the ones that get measured and focused on very deliberately. You'll notice that year over year, nearly all of these have increased. We've seen small improvements in auto theft, break and enter, and stabbings. All of the other areas have increased in terms of the volume that are being reported. And of course, the things that would translate from that would be the number of investigations which would ensue following them, the victim support required, disclosure of evidence in court, and time to actually complete and finalize investigations. And so substantial amount of effort, and again, speaking to that demand for these types of services throughout the organization, we are seeing these increase, and it is notable in some ways. As the CAO mentioned, these are numbers which are not really comparable to other jurisdictions in Canada, and in many ways in North America, there's very few comparators of jurisdictions that would experience this volume of events. And you'll note that these are predominantly violent events, so events against people which are impacting life and safety. And so I will pause there, turn it back to the CAO for further discussion.
So as we head into 2025, I do think it's always important to remember our history. And to the extent possible, the next few slides, we are trying to go back to 2001 to recognize, the increased period of investment in the first 10, 12 years, and followed by, a period of austerity. And so what you can see on this chart is when you adjust for inflation and population, our funding and officer levels are very similar to that 2000, 2002 sort of period. Certainly the city's growth accelerated more in the last number of years. And as I mentioned earlier, even going back to 2001, we're up 600,000 almost residents, but really the majority of that growth was, let's say, in the last decade. And so the question always becomes, well, where has all the funding gone? And so I think it's important to put that into context. The budget increased, the service budget increase going back to 2001 has averaged about 3.2% a year. But when you look at the collective agreements that are not within the services control, they have effectively taken, or we've had to allocate 85% of our annual increases towards collective agreements, because the average collective agreement increases are about 2.6%. And so what this chart can also show you is that all the gains and the investment that was made in 2001 to 2011, most of that was offset between 2012 and 2021. And so the service certainly has taken significant steps, as we have talked about, in terms of modernizing in order to absorb inflationary impacts, to absorb growth in demand, and certainly change the way we work. And so what you'll see, the light colored bars that kind of go down, that represents the discretionary cost cutting, whether that's salary and non-salary, that we have undertaken in order to contain the budget since 2010-2011 period. Also, if you compare the services budget from the peak of 2010-2011, we are taking a lower share of the city's overall budget on both a gross and net basis. Again, recognizing that is the peak. When you go back to 2001, the current share is fairly proportionate to where we were in the early 2000s. And the other way to look at maybe the impact of some of the fiscal constraint, you can also see that when you look at budget per capita. When adjusted for inflation, there is a $275 million difference between where we could have been had the 2010-2011 funding levels just sort of continued versus where we're currently at. The other metric that's just interesting to note is when we look at nationally, what the national median is for kind of mid-sized cities and spending on police in Canadian cities, we're considerably less. So that's, $500 per resident or per capita versus $363. And that, if we quantified that, is about $400 million. And so when looking at other major cities, Canadian and North American, you can certainly see the gap, and this is a slide that we present almost every year. You can see the gap from a officer per 100,000 population sort of metric. But again, the reality is these are guides. It informs, it suggests a trend, but it is not definitive in and of itself. Every city has its own jurisdiction and their own arrangements in terms of how borders are handled or how transit is handled, how waterways are done, how bylaw is done. So it serves as a guide, but city to city, those dynamics on jurisdiction and what other services are in the mix do look different. The other comparison that often happens is, Toronto with other Ontario cities and, the dynamics between the suburbs and an urban center. And so really what this is intended to show is that there should be a gap. If you think of where the hub of activity happens, it's in the urban centers, predominantly through the major stadiums, through the events and protests. And you'll see the gap between Toronto and our suburb peers, and you'll see there's really not much of a gap there at all. It's quite flat. And so that dynamic is certainly something to look at. Maybe next month we can also talk about the crime severity index, because there are notable differences between Toronto's versus the broader GTA in that lens. And so diving into really where are we at in terms of the 2025 budget and sort of the development process, our priorities will likely remain the same from last year. Director Williams talked about some of the gains and some of the impacts that we have seen from the investments that we did receive in 2023 and 2024, but there is certainly still more work to do. And I think it's important, especially with new members, just to recap on how did we even arrive at the 2024 budget. And so I just wanted to recap how we got there, because it will influence where we go in some of the discussions in 2024. So as always, we have a starting point that's submitted to the city, and then we spent last year a few months refining that. We adjusted the hiring plan from 120 to 90 a class. We reviewed some of the anticipated revenue, adjusted it for some grants that we felt were more certain that were coming in, and we flatlined expenses, we cut reserves. But there are some notable items in terms of the bridging actions that we worked on with the city, and certainly, you know, the final council motion that was put in place in order to meet the board-approved ask. And so why that matters is because there are items from last year that will, in one shape or form, reverse on us this year, or at minimum, they are up for discussion from a staff-to-staff standpoint. And so the right-hand slide gives you a sense of the many, many decision points that we are actively working on to estimate, to refine the estimate, to confirm what assumption we should be baking in to our budget. Some of it is within the services hands, but a lot of it is certainly staff-to-staff discussions with the city as well. The bridging strategies are not insignificant. Each one of the bridging actions is $10 to $12 million. And so effectively, depending on what that assumption looks like, you know, if it's in or out of the budget, does it count as our difference, does it not? Each one of those is effectively 1%. Reserves is another big area for us this year. Premium pay and reserves is typically the first thing we cut heading into a budget in the name of affordability. And what I can tell you is certainly for the vehicle and equipment reserve, we are at a very critical point, even in 2024, where we are potentially entering into a deficit on that reserve. And so the ability for cost cutting and containment on some of our reserves, given how many years we've done this for, is now certainly starting to catch up. The multi-year hiring plan everyone knows about. It is of significant influence in terms of where we end up. And then the other big area is all the contractual pressures. Collective agreement is probably the biggest, but I would also expect, and I would expect Toronto Police not to be unique in this, but that other emergency services and the city broadly is also facing similar pressures, whether it's, you know, the employee statutory entitlements, whether it's IT contracts and life cycling, which all are seeing increases through our vendors. And so you will see a theme around IT and contractual increases in our budget. It is significant heading into 2025. And certainly the full board meetings, you're starting to hear the CIO came last month, he's coming this month to provide more insight in terms of the dynamics of IT, some key investments, and generally where it's headed. And we expect in the budget, we will also spend some time talking about that. And then the last two buckets, one is the program areas. And so really what that represents is what is staying the same in terms of service levels, what are new programs or programs we started this year that we're hoping to continue, and what is, if any, reallocation reductions that we need to do internally. We are focused Like last year, we are focused on investigative capacity. We are absolutely focused on frontline priority response and being able to reduce it. The other area is obviously NCO expansion. We know that is important to the city. It is important to the board. We are looking at how to do a modest, at minimum a modest, neighborhood community officer expansion, even if it means reallocation of existing resources. That is part of the discussions we're currently having. And then lastly, the revenues. That is the grants. Maybe impacts of some of the intergovernmental discussions, implications, if any, on the new Ontario deal that was in place last year. And so each of these buckets and the sub-bullets below that, they all represent individual discussions and a key assumption or a number. And so for the November 27th meeting and in our board report, we will talk about each one of those and the assumptions we've made in the budget. And so moving on to capital, this is very preliminary. It is still very much in the works, but we are currently looking at a potential capital program for 2025 at around 100 million. Just for reference, in 2024, the capital program was 88 million, and our spend rate is very strong because many of our capital programs are in the thick of implementation. So we are not in the planning stages, we are firmly in execution, and when you're doing a facilities project, like we're currently building and renovating a division, I mean, you end up executing and your spend rate and your ability to achieve your capital plan does increase over time. What you'll also see in terms of where the capital is going, 85% of our capital plan is a combination of facilities, equipment, and technology. And the 10-year capital plan at the moment, again, very preliminary, is looking at around $1 billion over 10 years. How that compares to what we presented last year it was 800 million. And so if you consider, what are the projects? So on the left-hand side, these are projects in progress. They're baked, they're in the capital plan, they've been budgeted, they're in some form of implementation, they're well down a path, and we report on them in our on our quarterly capital variance. The discussion is really in the upcoming and in the priority needs. What are those projects? What is the priority? And how do we fit them into our overall program and the city's, whether debt targets and funding, available funding streams in order to meet that. And so those are the pieces that are in particular under discussion and refinement. And so after all of this, what are we really hoping to achieve? If someone said, what does a Toronto Police budget this year buy us? And so absolutely, we want to continue focusing on core service delivery. We want to focus our efforts around prevention, public order, and obviously keep the city moving. We are hoping that the final approved budget allows us to reduce the frontline priority response times, to increase case closure rates, and to continue modernizing how we actually deliver our services. We do know NCOs, neighborhood community officers, is a priority, and we are hoping that the 2025 budget creates a path one way or another to allow us to have even a modest expansion. And then internally, we are hoping that the 2025 budget allows us to continue to pursue modernization. Some of it is enabled through the new org chart that we will be representing before the end of the year, because through that org chart, we are looking to enable things like investigative standardization, continue to automate and kind of enable digital work, and continue to overhaul and modernize all of our people processes. But ultimately, we do recognize that collectively we need to work on longer term sustainability. And we are committed, you have my commitment, the chief's commitment, the command's commitment to work with the city and with the board on different funding models and certainly the role of other levels of government and participate actively in those discussions. And so I just want to, just in conclusion, as the last slide, just a reminder of where we're at in the process. In the thick of a process, but still relatively early. Still many, many meetings and administrative reviews and decision points along the way. And we will keep the board apprised at every opportunity over the next few months. I'll pause there and turn it over to questions.
Thank you, Deputy Dhaliwal. And thank you for the presentation, and as well, Director Williams, for all your comments. At this point in time, we do have a number of deputations, and then afterwards we will have questions. There are some folks, I understand you folks are just going to move aside, and then after we do the deputations, you'll come back, because in the event people have questions for you. The very first deputant we have is John Harley, and Mr. Harley is virtual.
Thank you.
Just take a minute to make sure we have Mr. Harley online.
Can you hear me?
I can sort of hear him.
Can you hear me?
Mr. Harley, we can barely hear you. I wonder if you could turn up your volume
I will try to do that.
on his own computer.
How about that? Is that any better?
Just a little, if you could, yeah, try to put it at the highest volume and maybe, you know, it sometimes depends where you sit in relation to your laptop. Like sometimes you need to sit a little bit back.
Maybe I'll try and sit closer. I am at 100%.
Okay, we can hear you. Thank you so much, Mr. Harley, and please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for entertaining me here. And I'm here to urge you in your considerations to take steps, the steps necessary to implement automated noise enforcement as part of your considerations. It's been a long time since Hartley has spoke to the Police Services Board. My father actually played an active part in the board back in the 60s. He got somewhat disillusioned as a result of that experience. And I think you all know the importance of gaining, maintaining, and encouraging the trust that is so important for policing. In fact, it's probably the paramount importance for your success. So what I'm asking you to do today is just a small way of not only encouraging, maintaining, but increasing a trust and enforcement that's so necessary in the city. I've lived in the East End of Toronto virtually my entire life. I moved to the West End as a result of some of the problems that actually plague our city. They caused me to form an organization called SOS, Save Our City, as an incorporated entity to address some of those problems. My journey brought me in contact with the lady, Ingrid Boudet, who runs an organization called No More Noise Toronto, and her initiatives to improve life in this city. And that's what actually brings me here today. The city is in an incredibly challenging financial situation. Just listening to the presentation today, honestly, it's the job that you folks have in front of you is extremely challenging. I would suggest that our police services are probably even more overwhelmed than our sewers, our roads, our social services, and our schools. Automated enforcement of noise violation represents an opportunity to improve the life of Torontonians without breaking the bank. Indeed, it actually will raise funds for the city, funds that the city obviously so desperately needs. This is really, honestly, it's a no-brainer. Rules without enforcement are not only dysfunctional, they're an invitation to misconduct. There really is no constituency for noise violations. And I suspect that many of the violators don't even know the extent to which they are actually violating the peace and good government of our city. It's in that vein that I urge you, as part of your considerations, to ensure that a task force is formed to ensure the effective implementation of automated noise enforcement technology. We have automated enforcement for speed, for red lights. We're about to get it for streetcar passing. So the technology exists, the need exists, the opportunity is beckoning. Let's make it happen. Subject to your questions, just thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harley. Are there any questions of Mr. Harley? Seeing none, thank you, sir, for coming out.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next deputant is Ingrid Boudet. Understand, Ms. Boudet's here.
That's what I've done when I've been in this room before.
Please take your time.
Thank you so much, Chair Morgan. And that should bring me up. Okay, well, it is a treat to actually be here to share my thoughts with you. And so thank you, Chair Morgan and the Toronto Police Board and staff for taking the opportunity and for giving me this opportunity. My name is Ingrid Boudet and I am founder of No More Noise Toronto. We are a data and process-oriented grassroots organization that are taking a collaborative approach to reducing the noises that wake us up, keep us up, and disturb us during the day. We have over 1,350 subscribers to Noise News, and we've got many followers on social media, and I also have the support of FOSTRA and FONTRA, which is the Federation of North Toronto Residents Associations and South Toronto Residents Associations. So I've got over 100,000 people that are supporting my work. So who are the members of No More Noise Toronto? Well, generally we're people that are tired, we're frustrated, and we've encountered processes that don't work. So I look to understand my members, and when I ask them what noise sources disturb you, moving motor vehicle noise is far and away the most popular one. It is the most ubiquitous, and it's everywhere. And the problem that impacts us the most is that the process to report moving vehicle noise is broken. I reported this to Municipal Licensing and Standards. Mr. Grant understands this, and he says that this workflow is correct. So let me walk you through it from left to right. I'm at home sleeping in my bed. I get woken up by a loud vehicle. I'm told to call 311 for everything. They say thanks very much, but moving vehicle noise is actually a police matter, and thanks for the data point, the case is closed. So then I might try and call again, but it's 3:30 in the morning, and I can either call or go to the website. I don't have a picture, I don't have a description of the vehicle, I don't have anything. And so generally the complaint isn't made. So we're at a broken process. Nobody gets resolution. So this is my main noise complaint as well, and so I don't live with a 24-hour average. There's peak noise events. And so I go with sound level meters and I measure noise at people's homes and I count noise spikes. And I did a buffer analysis to understand how many people are exposed to this. And so we've got 665,000 people that live within 750 meters of a highway, 1.2 million people that live within 100 meters of an arterial road based on 2021 census data. I count a noise spike as 10 decibels above the average. On a highway, you get about 43 a day. On an arterial road, you get 142 a day. And this is from over 50 different measurements in different locations across Toronto. So we end up with tens of thousands of impacts, and then you multiply that by people and you're into the billions. So Toronto Public Health did a study in 2017 called How Loud is Too Loud? And the first bullet point is nearly 60% of noise in Toronto can be attributed to traffic noise. General moving vehicles are 70 to 80 decibels. Modified mufflers and stunt driving and racing easily punts that up to 80, 90. I've had 105 decibel spikes for people on the 15th floor at 3:30 in the morning. So what are those physical health outcomes of noise? You can see the list on the left, and the arrows all point to a deputation that I made from Toronto Public Health Healthy Aging Summary. And noise contributes to the top 3 chronic conditions, to the top cause of hospitalization, and the top cause of death for people aged 65 to 74 years. And guess what? We're all going there. So there's also mental health outcomes: annoyance, depression, sleep disturbance, Alzheimer's disease, dementia, and loneliness. So, and not to mention social isolation. So we need you to do something. And again, here we're to this moving vehicle noise task force. There's things that you can do. You can fix the reporting process. You can invest in training and tools to enforce the Highway Traffic Act, engage the public. I have a membership that is very willing to work with you and help you understand and work towards solutions and help us advocate to improve and strengthen the Highway Traffic Act. Of course, this requires municipal and city council collaboration and also help from the province. So we are a voice that will want to listen and work with you to get a solution to this. There's so many people that are seriously impacted, and we call it vanity noise because all it is to get attention. When people illegally modify their muffler, they're not doing that to go any faster. They're doing that to be noticed, and I don't want to notice them at 3:30 in the morning. So please help us. This problem will not go away on its own. That map is one that I put out to residents, and within about, I think about a week, we got 800 responses for where people thought that the illegal muffler inspection blitzes should happen in coordination with the city. So I got people that are engaged. So I'd like us to create a better Toronto by reducing noise and creating a sound measurement or a sound task force through the Toronto Police Services. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Boudet. Does anybody have any questions of Ms. Boudet? Councillor Carroll?
Just one, because Ingrid knows I'm very familiar with this, but you understand you're bucking the trend of a lot of Torontonians. What you're asking us to add a task to police when a significant population in the community is asking us to detask the police. So should we be asking MLS to do a better job, or are you really advocating adding a task to police?
Thank you so much, Councillor Carroll. I appreciate the question and the opportunity to clarify. So, Executive Director of Municipal Licensing and Standards, Carlton Grant, has admitted that basically they don't have the resources to tackle the illegal mufflers. And frankly, the Toronto Police Services hasn't been able to do a good job of it either because it's a moving issue and it's ubiquitous all over the place. So if moving vehicles are under the jurisdiction of the Toronto Police Service, then possibly that could be the task force where we solve the problem and invite the city to participate. Now, in all honesty, I understand that automated enforcement is anything to do with automation the city would purchase. So you're going to hear a lot about noise cameras coming up in the budget cycle, because if that is the way, so I've actually had conversations with different members of the Toronto Police Service, and I understand the problems. It is difficult because the problem is gone even before we finish reporting it or try to report it. So what we need to do is basically look at that enforcement and look at it as a joint solution. So possibly what it is fix the reporting process, but create that task force that brings everybody together, and then we solve that problem possibly through noise cameras that then can, and if it's the city fine is $500 for an illegal muffler. For under the Highway Traffic Act, it's $110. So that could be a severe behavior modification for some. So I understand it could be confrontational, but I do think that none of us have a defense against sound, and this impacts everyone's health.
Right. I wanted to get that fleshed out because these guys are facing incredible pressure, but there's an advocacy piece here whereby, we've just heard the Premier say he's not adding anything to automated enforcement, but in fact, the same people altering their mufflers are the same people we're trying to catch for unsafe speeding. So, we take the correlation and both advocate for the ability to do the automated enforcement. It's a win. Yeah. Thank you. In your view, that would be a win. If both of us advocate, and at the end of the day, we get noise cameras, we'll we'll keep it in the city realm and charge the higher fine. Am I right?
Well, you know, we can always hope, but that's where, when I had the conversations with the Toronto Police Service, with a couple sergeants, I said, what would help? And they said automated enforcement. And so noise cameras could be one way of doing
Right.
it, there's other ways, but let's look at it, let's look at the whole process end to end and find that solution that doesn't actually require more bodies.
Thank you. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Bude. The next deputant is Sue DeGrandes. Thank you. Please go ahead.
I wish to thank the Toronto Police Service Board and Budget Committee for granting me this opportunity. My name is Sue DeGrandes. I live in the Christie Pitts neighborhood, and I'm a member of No More Noise Toronto. Our neighborhood is dotted with laneway garages where vanity noise is being created. Many of these garages are rented out to brokers. It's a business. They sublet them to young men who come deliberately there to alter their vehicles in what we call chop shops. They installed accelerated muffler noise-making equipment, readily available online and often installed in duplicates. They are available in mild, moderate, and aggressive. They install the aggressive and in duplicates. This is an illegal activity. It's in our neighborhood. It contravenes our residential bylaws, but it's unenforced. Second, this activity deliberately alters the factory-installed environmental protection laws, leading to increased greenhouse gas emissions. Third, the noise must contravene decibel levels, if there is such a thing that exists in our city. This noisy activity is an antisocial behavior, well documented by professors at the University of Western Ontario. This study says, who likes loud cars? This study suggests they skew young, they skew male, they score high on psychopathy and sadism. We citizens of Toronto are fed up with this highly invasive noise. It disturbs our sleep. We feel being held hostage to this antisocial behavior. We have nowhere to go with our complaints. We try, and we get no results. We wake up at night, we cannot return to sleep. Tall condo buildings, this noise ricochets up the side. It messes with our equilibrium and it leads to health issues. I can attest to that. I have a health issue, and every time I leave Toronto, within a day or two, it disappears. The stress of living with this kind of noise, which disturbs our sleep, leaves us sleep deprived, and as seniors, we are vulnerable. Not only do we have psychological problems with this, we have physiological. Our police force does not have sufficient resources to safely apprehend these offenders. Technology to the rescue. Noise cameras has to be considered. They have successfully been implemented in New York City and many European and UK cities, and with effective results that stand up in court and increase the income. When accompanied by hefty fines, it's a fantastic deterrent as to this antisocial behavior. We are fed up as we're being held hostages and we have nowhere to go with our complaints. It's driving us crazy and it's making us ill. I'm requesting that the City of Toronto prioritize in creating a noise task force to explore the opportunity to install noise cameras throughout our city. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. DeGrandes. Is there any questions for Ms. DeGrandes? Thank you. Seeing none, thank you. I'm advised that the next deputant, Mr. Tim Ellis, is not available. So we're going to move on to Linda Zixi. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Dear Toronto Police Service Board Budget Committee, my name is GC Lee Linda. and I'm the chair of Governance Committee of St. Jamestown Residents Council. I was forced to move out of town this summer because the noise there was unbearable. Illegally installed speaker horns inside apartments, sending out high decibel sound from 40 fire alarm systems, and the vehicle noises, etc. In the backyard of 200 Wellesley Street, that building, the noise from vehicle has gotten so loud this spring. The generator from food truck overnight sends out. The sound caused so many people complain about their headaches, earaches, head spinning. I called 311 multiple times, but in vain. The operator asked me to identify the noise source, which I was afraid to do so during midnight. When I asked her to send a police patrol on scene to check the noise, the operator answered, "Sorry, we don't have police patrol." Obviously, the 311 noise reporting system is broken because there's no police patrol to be sent there and no follow-up investigation on noises cases reported. So you need to do more to eliminate illegal exhaust and modifications on our streets and in our neighborhood. The loud audio assaults from a vehicle endanger the health of our residents, and this is part of your duty to serve and protect. You could upgrade police body camera to noise camera and implement a pilot solution quickly. This is a year-round problem that deserves year-round attention, fast action, and funding to make Toronto a more safe, healthy, and peaceful place to live. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any questions for ZC Lee Linda? Seeing none, thank you very much. The next gentleman is Felipe Tellez, and I believe Mr. Tellez is appearing virtually. Do we have him? We're just giving a minute. Mr. Tellez is on the line.
I think I'm unmuted now.
Yes, could you just turn up your volume slightly, Mr. Tellez, so we can just hear you?
Is this any better?
A little, maybe just a tad more, and thank you for accommodating us.
I can speak a bit louder if this is okay with you, yeah?
Yes, and I can hear you. Thank you so much, sir. Please go ahead.
All right. Lovely. Thank you. My name is Felipe. I've lived in a pedestrian-friendly neighborhood in Toronto for several years now. I'm around Yonge and Bloor, and I'm speaking on behalf of my community about the increasing noise pollution and safety concerns caused by speeding modified vehicles. The noise from these vehicles has become, it's unbearable and dangerous. While I'm sharing my experience, I'm fully aware that this is a widespread issue affecting other neighborhoods across the city. It's not just my area, it's everywhere. My neighbors and I share these concerns as there's sudden roars of modified engines that will startle pedestrians as you're walking down the street or enjoying just sitting down somewhere, and will in general disrupt daily life as well as regular nighttime. It's reached a point where walking around the community also feels unsafe because of stunt driving. And especially for children and older residents. On a weekly basis, we're subjected to what can only be described as auditory assaults. It just keeps on happening, and there's no way to properly report on this, as others have mentioned before me. These vehicles roar through the streets. Their sounds are echoing across the building, so it's very widespread. It's not just the noise, it's the danger posed by the stunt driving as well in heavily pedestrian trafficked areas as well. I understand that the Toronto Police Services is stretched rather thin with other priorities at this point, but this is extremely important as well. The issue cannot be ignored, and it directly impacts the health and safety of Toronto residents. Many neighborhoods have become hubs for speeders as well. There's literally groups that go around doing the same thing. I've seen the same car lap around the same block more than 5 times within the span of 20 minutes, doing nothing but just bother everybody that is around them. And bother is a very light word for what is actually happening. I'm requesting that a dedicated task force be created to specifically address that issue, as other callers and speakers have pointed before me. The task force could work collaboratively with the city to focus on enforcement, proactive solutions, and piloting new strategies that, as has been mentioned, doesn't employ new and more bodies on the issue, instead focusing on potentially automation. The creation of the task force could allow for year-round attention to this ongoing problem and ensure that these disruptive behaviors are addressed effectively, as there's currently no true way to basically report an incident. It's impossible to report an incident, and that's one of the biggest issues. More than just enforcement, this task force could explore solutions, like the cameras mentioned, and harsher penalties for repeat offenders. Public awareness campaigns could also play a big role and help and mitigate this problem. This is a year-long problem, and hopefully a solution can be reached to feel safe walking in the streets of Toronto.
Thank you, Mr. Tellez. Are there any questions for Mr. Tellez? Seeing none, I just want to thank, because I believe that might complete all the speakers who have actually been talking a little bit about the noise that they're enduring in their different neighborhoods. I live in a neighborhood, it's really noisy too. My husband's noisier though when he snores, so I do appreciate and thank you so much for coming and bringing to our attention and to as well the councillor's attention. The next deputant is Miguel Avila, here in person.
Good afternoon. Thank you for allowing me to speak today. I missed you guys at the last September meeting. I wasn't able to speak, but anyway, here we are. I want to start in a good way. I want to greet my Jewish neighbors with the words Shana Tova. I want to greet my Muslim neighbors with the words Assalamu alaikum. I want to talk about the current state of protests in the city of Toronto. I'm speaking as a seasoned protester in the city of Toronto. I've been out there for 14 years, protesting many good activist movements. I Don't Know More, Black Lives Matter, police accountability, etc., animal rights, moving the elephants from the Toronto Zoo to California, for instance, one of the good things I did in conjunction with other people. I only have to say about this conflict is that if our elected leaders will do the right thing today, we won't have to be out in the streets. Today is the largest movement I have ever seen in my life. And I do wish peace for all my Muslim and Jewish friends. I don't want them harmed or anything like that. But if our leaders will act consciously and find solutions, we will have time to spend with our families, time to just continue working to build this city. Anyhow, I'm here to speak on this matter, and I have some ideas that perhaps for you guys may be a little bit, can I see this in the overhead? Sorry. Oh, there you are. Okay, so this little fellow over here on the is being used in the United States. We were talking about video cameras in place. These guys can patrol several places like malls, parking lots, and my intention is to bring new technologies to for you guys to consider. This guy costs less than $60,000 a year. The maintenance, it could save money to the city. We can start to have robocalls with AI technology and video cameras to address something that we just hear about noises. The MLS, they need more inspectors. Perhaps, as I said before, reset the police is not a bad idea. You have 12 collective agreements with different unions that you can perhaps ship staff from the Toronto Police so they don't lose their jobs and they can be shifted to other areas of the city where you have 12 collective agreements, where they can take this staff without losing their money. Because when I talk about defunding police, everybody gets scared. Oh my God, I'm gonna lose my job. No, I don't want you to lose your job. I just want to reduce the number of staff in the police so that the budget is less, and then we can have money to fund programs like we discussed yesterday, executive committee, which is the universal food programs. And then we have other opportunities to help our residents to buy those affordable buildings so it can become permanent affordable housing for many residents of the city. So addressing the issue of budget could help in a big way the residents of Toronto. Modernizing our police goes a long way as well. And this little fellow, I just showed you the picture, will address some of these concerns for night patrols. Instead of 2 staff in 1 cruiser, we have this little fellow who is fearless and will go around and patrol our communities, and we'll have his camera on all the time and record anything. You know, we have AI technology, so in case somebody's wanted, you guys right away can go in and capture that person. I don't want to cut your core service. You guys do an excellent job of prosecuting criminals, finding crime solutions, et cetera, et cetera. Those things we will never take it away. But if we have now the crisis response center that is response for all the city requires funding. The traffic wardens is another good program. We can start to decrease the number of staff at the service police, at the Toronto Service Police Service. Thank you.
Thank you, Miguel.
Oof, a lot of ideas.
Thank you. Any other questions for Miguel? Go ahead, Councilor
Quick question. Hi, Miguel, and thank you for that, Shana Tova, and assalamu alaikum back to you. I'm interested because you do dwell in all of these activist groups. They are the very same groups that a few years ago I would have expected if when we talked about putting more cameras in the public realm. They found that an invasion of privacy. And I saw the video about this AI policing robot, and I thought, will that get people all exercised about privacy? Is this something you've discussed with people within your sort of social groups?
Well, it's some degree is discussed. We will want to see us address the issues that we have of poverty, address violence. So whatever it helps to reduce the burden on the city taxpayers, it will go a long way. And I just want to add, this is my 14th year also attending the police budget meetings. So I'm not being a stranger.
Yeah.
And I bring whatever idea is possible to help our Toronto residents. The goal is to build a better city and peacefully.
Right. So you'd be an advocate for it out there in the community if it allowed us to let officers focus on the places where they need to be right now.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Thanks a lot for coming
Thank you,
today.
Miguel, and we always appreciate you come to the budget meetings. Last year, actually, Miguel stayed after 12 hours. He actually voted in favor of it. So even though he doesn't have a vote, we appreciate your passion and your activism. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're very welcome.
The next deputant is Alberto Barrero. He is apparently not online and not available. So we go to Mr. Langenfeld, Chris Langenfeld. Can you hear me?
Can you hear me, Chair?
I can, thank you. When you're ready, please go ahead, Mr. Langenfeld.
Thank you, Chair Morgan, and I trust you can see the screen share that I'm doing here.
Yes, I can.
So
thank you.
Great, thanks. So looking at from the presentation today from the service, you had the breakdown of budget increases on page 25 of the PDF. And below that here, I put the CPI inflation rates for Canada over the roughly the same period. And you'll notice that the CPI is, other than in 2021 and 22, is below 3% the entire time. And the police budget increases, certainly from 2000 to 2011, are well above the amount of CPI inflation. So right there, we actually had a huge increase in the budgets for policing over that period from 2000 to 2010. And we had one of the speakers at the last budget meeting, or at the last regular meeting, speaking about the fact that in truth, the population rose only a little bit during that period of time from 2000 to 2010, and yet the number of police officers increased, and at the same time, the response time, in fact, decreased over that period. And as we know, in 2010, that's when we had the G20 issue, where the auditor, or the ombudsman, I should say, for Ontario, called the report "Caught in the Act," referring to the actions of police during that time. And so really what we've seen is that during that period where we had a huge increase in the number of policing, or the number of police officers, what we ended up with was the poorer response, poorer law enforcement, and violations of people's rights by the increased number of police officers. And so that's one of the reasons that I simply don't agree that we need more police. We need a different number of police responding to the calls. But looking at all the other charts that you're given, we know that the service hasn't gone back to that 2000-year time frame, the prior 10 years that all these charts show, in order to provide you all the actual data that has been pointed out. The service has picked they've cherry-picked 2010, where there were the maximum number of officers, and they based everything going from there, saying, oh, we need to go higher from that and match that high number. But of course, looking at what we've got is police officers, 3 arrested, 19 officers there to do it. 1 homeless woman, 6 officers sent to respond. 1 man yelling because he was called a bad name, 6 officers are there to deal with it. And that is obviously a problem, and yet the service, or the board, I should say, hasn't asked the service to report any of that information. Going back to the commentary of Sean Meager from September, I think it was, 7 hours into the meeting or the video, he mentions how response time was faster in 2000 when the cop-to-pop ratio was lower than it was in 2010. At 7 hours, 1 minute and 45 seconds, Deputy Mayor Morley asked him what the increase was, and that was where he pointed out that there were 600 fewer officers in 2000 than there were in 2010, and yet the response times increased as a result of the reduction in the number of officers. And of course, all this spending that we've done on technology and things of that nature, the whole point of that was to reduce the number of officers that we needed to do the same amount of work. But then instead we go back and say, okay, now we've spent all this money on technology, we're increasing it another 20% for the next year, let's still go back and hire all the same officers we had before. I'll also touch on this issue of noise violations, which people have been bringing up. Personally, I'm not a fan of having a bunch of cameras, or I should say microphones, put around the city. We had that recommendation with, I think it was ShotSpotter or something like that. So what I would suggest or ask is, does the current city bylaw make it illegal to make more than a certain number of decibels worth of noise? Or does the bylaw say that it's illegal to have a muffler that makes a certain amount of decibels of noise when it's revved at a certain number of RPMs, which would allow your officers to go back and check this out afterwards at a speeding ticket stop or something like that? They wouldn't have to catch them in the act. I would also suggest that maybe we should be approaching the Premier about making those types of mufflers illegal and make it large fines for possessing, selling, or installing those types of illegal modifications on vehicles rather than trying to hire more cops or put in technology. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Langenfeld. Are there any questions of Mr. Langenfeld? Seeing none, thank you very much, Mr. Langenfeld. And we'll likely see you at the next board meeting. At this point in time, before we get to questions, anybody has questions of the presentation team? We got a lot of written submissions today. So I'm just going to acknowledge those folks. Amanda Yates, Gail Vigiani, Bruce Mitchell, Ekarina Habus, Bev McCarthy, Sinan Amoglu, Sam Keobekov, Tamara Bernstein, Laura LaMarche, Juan Naranjo, Philomena Venditti, Robert Barnett, Teresa Becker, Sharon Thompson, Linda, Ingrid Vanderzand, Cameron Allen, Grant, Gregory Wilson, Susan DeGrandis put a written submission in as well, Alexander Doulis, Carol, Keith Toby, Don Young, Maria Ludasan, Mandy Sala, Anatole Modi, Beverly Bitterman, Deborah O'Brien, Mike Shinoko, Harold B. Smith, TJ Machado, Gail Beebe, Gail and George Ganatakis, Stephen Jacobs, Darlene Ann Verlo, Janet Griffiths Maximum, John Liss, Daniel Bosch, John Sewell, Eric Shelton, Melissa Prowski, Leslie Solomon, Mary Ambrose, Michael Goldstein, Leslie, Deanna, Barbara Cook, Deanna Scriver, Jane Unan, Trish U, Ronald Jones, Janet Looker, Alexi Marcillo, Patricia Koutsaris, Alexandra Thaler, Rasha Coleman, Christopher Wilson, Sandra Halbert, Sita Elbekian, Julia Robertson, Sally Gustin, and Nicole Corrado. So thank you for all those written submissions. At this point in time, I'd like to go back, and is there anyone who has any questions on the presentation for the team? Councillor Carroll, please go ahead.
I do. Oh, yes. It's just follow-up, because I have had a chance to have a conversation with Savina about the conversations ongoing about the hiring plan. Budget Committee gave the motion to keep working with city staff, and we know the submission. Formally, we haven't given them our submission yet. We're still talking, but I see it talks about city's administrative review starting October 29th. Does that mean currently they don't have our global budget submission?
So through you, Chair, there is a submission that we make through the city's process. It was around September 10th, September 12th.
Oh, so they do, so they got an early draft?
Yes, and we've had discussions on what that preliminary draft looks like, where is there room for refinement, and then subsequent to that, after this motion, we met with them another time to talk about the hybrid staffing plan specifically.
Okay, I asked that with my other budget hat on because soon small groups of budget committee members will start looking, but the board's still at such early days yet that that's when they should sort of save to the end of that informal process, I would assume. For looking over the hiring plan, I only remember this because we went back and forth. Doobie's not here today, is he? We went back and forth on the wording of that motion that we did to keep working on the hiring plan. And the wording that we arrive at, I have in my phone because we went back and forth, but the wording in this presentation has ended up being the old wording. We put sort of what was in the draft motion. I put in B was the need to address the current officer to population ratio, and then on to C. And it had been changed to, when it went up on the screen, improves on the current cop to pop ratio. And I asked that be changed back, and that was what we voted on, because we're trying to leave it so that, because improves could mean different things to different people. So we wanted to use that wording so that it meant we got to keep discussing this, and in general, we're focused around cop to pop. But improve sort of guarantees a certain number in people's mind, and we wanted to leave it open.
So all I know is, so through the chair, I think we received that motion through the board office, but certainly we can, I think the sentiment around addressing the cop to pop is, the sentiment I think is reflected in the discussions, but you know, we're happy to update the slide if it was the wrong motion.
We went back and forth, but I remember saying it, I'd rather vote on it in that wording, and that is the way we voted on it. Yeah, you can look at that after. Yeah, yeah.
There it is.
Yeah. It just sticks out in my mind because we went back and forth about it. That's the only reason I remember it so clearly. And that is the key piece. While the city has a submissions, they have some idea of what we're going to vote on at the board. That's such a central piece to it that's the thing we've got to go back and forth on, the chief, the city finance, et cetera, to get to where we need to get. The other thing is, when looking at the increases, we have to keep in mind that when you get to recording the 24 year, even in looking in 24, already the issue of the collective bargaining not having been done, it impacts us when we're looking on a graph, both 24 and 25.
So depending on when, if 2024 is addressed this year, then that would be a budget adjustment to this year's budget. Right. So it all depends on when all of that is settled. In terms of how mechanically we end up, you know, do you go back and restate the previous year, or do you all put it in to 1 year? And so we'll have to talk to the CFO about how to do that, and it all depends on when it's settled. And how do you do with the previous year if you only settle it, let's say, in 2025? But if we do kind of settle something this year, then the 2024 portion will be just a budget restatement for 2024.
Right. So whenever the arbitrated settlement does come, it then changes our graphs and the way we're showing our data.
Yes, and the comparables from 1 year to another would adjust as well. Right.
I don't know if anybody else has a question. I did have another one. Oh, the other one, this is a trick question. It's kind of for Ian, I think. There's a couple of places here. I think there's one graph that goes all the way back to 2001. And I don't think this changes things appreciably, but it does change it a little bit when we're carefully calculating the officer to population ratio over and over again. There's a certain point in time at which we sort of shifted. We used to be fairly strict about what we called the population of Toronto, because what we had was the most recent census data. And then we were really conservative in our estimations, because you really don't know until a census comes out. But with the dawn of better data management, we started only a few years ago to begin to be pretty precise, as we began to have many more metrics. So, for instance, not a lot of people know that our population really is more like 3.2 million now. Some people are still waiting for us to get to 3 million. In fact, we know, because we have better access to data nowadays, that it's really more like 3.2. So that does kind of skew when we're doing graphs, only slightly, but it does skew it somewhat, does it not?
Yeah, and just to confirm, we use a mix, so StatsCan, where available, but then there is a point in
okay.
time where StatsCan's not available, so then we use Ministry of Finance. And this is a source, like this is a topic that comes up. I mean, when we do our environics analysis, they actually use a few different sources to bring it together. We try to use a government source, but maybe the director can comment on the variability.
Yeah, I can speak to that.
Yeah.
So it's, we do use the actuals where we have them, so largely based on census actual.
Yeah.
Of course, you know, there's lots of nuances to this. Undocumented Torontonians, for example, wouldn't be included in that through a census or otherwise. So there'd be a number of, you know, variables, and we're not using forecasts as well. There's different forecasts that we could apply. But it's the census data generally for the most recent periods.
But we've got to use new and undocumented because we serve them.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And response times versus staffing. We're still in the situation where that's the average response time. And I face this in the community all the time. First of all, I instructed city staff when they're doing reporting out on this, and even our comms, please always add the word average, because if it's happening right now, wherever possible, and using our heads, the priority needing to be way shorter than 17 minutes does happen. You know, that we want to be able to give the public that assurance that when we say 17, A, it's an improvement, but B, that is the average. Am I right?
That's correct. And the average, if we look at the P1, the average over, you know, approximately 20,000 events so far this year. So high number. If we look at certain types of events, like a shooting, sound of gunshots, person with a gun, those active firearm related events.
Yeah, and if it's still active.
Those get very short response times, like minutes.
Okay, because that's there's the improvement, and then there's that. One last question. Of the officers that we hired last year, while we're looking at this, we're looking at the hiring plan and what we can do between now and, say, FIFA. Just as an example, it's the thing that keeps me up at night. For this year, we've had 2 years in a row now. We sort of started the hiring plan before we had a formal hiring plan. We've been hiring. How many of last year's hires are now actually boots on the ground, or are they still substantially in the training?
So so for 2023 hires, the last class would have been December 2023.
Right.
And they would have been deployed this summer. So all of the 2023 hires are now deployed.
Okay.
At the last, when we there's a slide when we presented the multi-year hiring that gave a view of from January to, I believe it was August of this year, like where have we deployed our resources?
Right,
So
yes.
there are a couple hundred that have been deployed to the front line. And then there's I'm going to say about 50 that have been deployed to special ops. There's a small number for Resolute and all of the demonstrations. There's less than 10 that have gone to what you would call corporate projects. We keep that updated, and we will present that again. With every class that's deployed, we look at where the internal transfers are happening and where everyone's being deployed, because we have made commitments in the budget around where we intend to deploy them. And so we are on track to meeting the commitments that we did make in the beginning of this year and last year.
So is it safe to say then that if we keep up the pace, if we keep having that hiring plan, if we're trying to get to the better ratio and at a minimum keep the ratio, but make improvements, if we keep this pace with the adoption of the budget, we'll probably keep that timing of the following summer, you have the people from the budget before beginning to roll into service.
Yeah, so the hiring period is 6 months. So that would continue, and I think that's the importance of maintaining some level of hiring in every class. When Ian was talking about there was a graph that showed at different points of deployment, you see a noticeable drop in the response time. And so we're tracking that weekly and looking at the patterns around deployment and when the impact of that deployment can then be felt in terms of our response.
Right, thank you. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Were there any other questions? Then I believe that completes our October 2nd budget meeting. Our next meeting will be in the North York Civic Centre, Council Chambers. I believe the time is like 1:30 to 3:30, but I could be stand corrected. It is daytime. That's the best time to see North York. Yeah. So having completed this meeting, can I have a motion to adjourn? Yes, Councilor Carroll. Anybody second? Lisa, Vice Chair Kostakis, and I don't think all in favor. And then we will see you again at the next budget subcommittee on November 27th. And thank you to everybody for coming. And Shana Tova, because it is Jewish New Year, that's why Doobie's not here. And peace to everybody. Thank you.